Thank you all for joining us here today at the end of day one of the NAIA virtual convention. My name is Brett Iliff, and I'm the Director of Corporate Sponsorships with the NAIA. I'm excited to introduce two of our national partners here and leading industry experts to bring us home today. First, Dr. Jim Borchers is the co-founder and president of the United States Council for Athletes' Health. Dr. Borchers has been instrumental in helping the NAIA navigate the last 14 months with respect to COVID, return to play, and certainly through our championship season the past few months. We're grateful for Dr. Borchers and everything he's done for us. Also excited to introduce Jason Montgomery. He's a partner with our official law firm partner, Hush Blackwell. He has a background in higher education, including representation of colleges and student athletes in eligibility, compliance, and regulatory matters. And we're excited for him to share his expertise with us today. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Borchers. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Brett. And thank you to everyone who's joining us here today at the end of a long day. We were just mentioning we know there's Zoom fatigue. So thank you so much for having us. I know Jason and I are both extremely happy to be here, and we're proud to be working with Jason and others as we talk about these issues with the NAIA. I also just want to say congratulations and thank you to the NAIA for really navigating what has been just an incredible time over the last 12 to 14 months. And thank you for your partnership and collaboration with us at the U.S. Council for Athletes' Health and everything that we've been able to collaborate on over that time period. We value, our relationship, and so we're excited to be here to present with you today. Next slide, Brett. So our agenda today is really to discuss issues beyond COVID. I mean, there are other health and safety issues that are coming forward, and we thought this was an opportune time to be able to do that. So we want to discuss some strategies for NAIA colleges and universities to address these health and safety issues for student athletes. We really want to review the inter-association recommendations for prevention of catastrophic injury and death in college athletes and the requirements that are there in this document and the application to NAIA colleges and universities, and how from a medical health and safety standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint, how those recommendations are becoming best practice and looking at standards for colleges, athletic organizations, and universities to apply to. And then really want to discuss some of the requirements from that document and strategies and solutions to meet some of those recommendations. And so next slide here. I think one of the things that we wanted to point out today is there are a number of emerging trends that are coming forward with student athlete health, safety, and wellness. And certainly one of the biggest things is that healthcare delivery to collegiate athletes is not just a necessity. I think in the past, many have looked at it as just one thing that was coming forward, but it is a priority. It is the largest area of risk to any organization that provides athletics, certainly to colleges and universities. And it's certainly an area where student athletes with an increased voice and their own participation and their ability to speak collectively as a group that certainly colleges and universities will need to address. And it's that student athlete centered approach that really drives this conversation. But it's really going to become imperative to initiate programs that follow best practice. And our goal here today is really to provide some of what that best practice looks like and to begin a conversation and discussion about what that might look like for colleges and universities in the future. Next slide. So I think here I'll turn it over to Jason for a couple slides to talk a little bit about risk management, because that's kind of where this discussion leads us as we think about why we need to engage in this discussion around these trends beyond COVID-19. Jason?
Thank you, Dr. Borchers, and thank you to the NAIA for allowing us to participate. And I'm excited in particular as a former NAIA student athlete myself to be affiliated with a law firm that is an official partner. And so we look forward to this discussion today. As Dr. Borchers mentioned, in the emerging trends in particular, one thing he noted was kind of the landscape of collegiate athletics. And when we talk about that, we're talking about the legislation that's being passed around the country, in some respects related to name, image, and likeness, but also related to college athletes' health and well-being. And in particular, the national legislation that's out there is going to contain some aspect of health and well-being and expectations for colleges and universities moving forward that may even come through Health and Human Services or even the CDC. So it's important from a risk management standpoint to have that on the forefront of your agenda as an athletics department, as an institution. And when we talk about general risk management, really this is an area of preventative law. What can we do, in three buckets to transfer risk, to eliminate risk, or certainly to control risk. And insurance and contracts, those are one areas to transfer risk and address financial consequences of something that occurred. But really policies and procedures and the athletics culture are ways to control risk. And what we're going to do today is talk about reducing risks that arise from poor management, instruction, or supervision that can lead to significant issues. And while we're doing this, I want you to think of this risk management, preventative legal in five key areas. One is effective training and educational programs. Two is developing unambiguous policies and procedures around areas and efficient procedures. Three is having some type of fair complaint procedures and a reliable investigative process. Four is ensuring that your department has clear and workable contracts and waivers. And then fifth is encompassing all of these areas so that you project a positive institutional image when it comes to culture and risk management. And today really is going to focus on 1 and 2 primarily. Next slide, please. And in this area, what Dr. Borchers will talk about, risk management really is about identifying what standard of care is reasonable for your institution to provide to student athletes. Courts and juries are called upon to look at evidence and methods for reducing risk that are available. And here we're going to talk about, one standard that is out there that we think will likely be applied to all institutions, inclusive of the NAIA. Next slide.
So Jason, thanks for those comments. So the document that Jason was referring to here today is the inter-association recommendations that we discussed on the prevention of catastrophic injury and sudden death in collegiate athletes. And I think it's really important to note that this document has been endorsed by 14 major medical organizations, which includes every major sports medicine or athletic medicine organization in the United States and many international medical organizations. And so when these types of recommendations are endorsed by these types of groups, they very quickly become best practice and the standard to which we're held to. Many of you know that another association, the NCAA, adopted these recommendations as association-wide policy effective as of August 1st, 2019, and are now requirements for NCAA institutions in 2020. And I think even more importantly, and as Jason mentioned, they have become the standard in both legal and medical journals for best practice for collegiate athletic programs. So many organizations will put together recommendations or guidelines or these sorts of lists that are out there. But this has really become a standard that all collegiate organizations need to be aware of when it comes to these sorts of issues that come up with health and safety. Next slide, please. So there are really 6 critical areas that really this document discusses, and we're going to discuss these briefly today because it's really important that we begin to think about how to institute this at our institutions and throughout our departments as we think about this step in building positive culture, but also in being proactive, as Jason mentioned. Sportsmanship, protective equipment, acclimatization and conditioning, which is a significant part of this document. And that's just plainly because there's a number of student athlete deaths and injuries that happen during acclimatization and conditioning activities. Emergency action planning, the actual responsibilities of athletics personnel, And then, as Jason mentioned, a fair emphasis on education and training and what's required for a very large group of people. And although this may seem sometimes as a daunting task, we feel that there's solutions that can help you to meet this standard and to be able to make it a part of a positive experience for your organization. But it's really important to know, as Jason mentioned, this document is now in our world becoming the legal playbook between risk management and legal counsel as we think about these sorts of recommendations. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over here to Jason just to talk for a minute about why this is a legal playbook and what legal playbook means. So Jason?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Borchers. And when I talk about legal playbook, really what I'm referencing is both from a risk management standpoint, key areas that you can hone in on at your institution to identify either through internal or external audits where you can improve the functioning of your department. And then I'm also talking about how plaintiffs, judges, juries will use these guidelines in a given case. And I'm speaking in generalities, but negligence is the most common cause of action that occurs when there's a medical care issue by an institution, a coach, or staff. And generally, this is going to be determined on a state-by-state basis using case law and the applicable statutes in that state. But what we really need to understand is that several states have an understanding that there is a special duty owed to college athletes different than typical students. And the theory essentially is that there is a special relationship between student athletes, athletics participants, and the institution because they were recruited to participate in intercollegiate athletics. Now, ultimately, negligence is a breach of that duty that's owed to these individuals. And the negligence standard necessitates a comparison of how institutions or individuals acted and how they should have acted. Next slide, please. And so the standard really is, what would a reasonable person do? And what we need to think about as we're talking about these inter-association requirements is that judges and juries are going to look at what a reasonable person would do with this information in front of them, with these standards of care that are out there and have been adopted both by the medical community and the legal community in journals, in practice in some respects. And that then results in the requirement that you look hard at your institution to apply these standards in a way that is meaningful for your institution and also is consistent with your resources. They're not going to have an expectation that you go beyond what you have the ability to do with your resources, but there is an expectation that you are doing something and moving in the correct direction to apply these standards. And with that, next slide, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Borchers to discuss the standards.
Thanks, Jason. And I think that one of the comments that I want to make before we start here is that this is not meant to be a session to overwhelm folks when we think about these, but I think that there's very specific ways that we can address this, and we've been working with institutions and associations to do this. And so we're going to talk about these 6 areas, and certainly if you have questions, you can enter them in the chat, and we can certainly try to answer some of those questions as we go along, or certainly at the end of this presentation. So please feel free to do that. The first area that these recommendations actually address is sportsmanship. And the areas to call out about this sportsmanship piece of these recommendations is that it asks that institutions and organizations address specific ethical issues required for all sports competitions around sportsmanship, but especially helmeted sports. And I think there's a specific call out here for helmeted sports. So any of your athletes that would be wearing some sort of protective headgear. And that it's really important in this sportsmanship piece that you explicitly direct that the use of the head or the helmet as a weapon to injure another athlete is prohibited. And that you are educating coaches and athletes on an annual basis that they should receive this sort of education about sportsmanship, ethical issues, and about using the head or the helmet as a weapon. And Jason, I think just quickly a comment from you on the importance of addressing this on an annual basis and the ability to make certain that you're compliant with these sorts of recommendations around this specific topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we discuss these different areas, one thing that it comes up consistently is the need for documentation so that we can demonstrate, were there to be an issue, that the institution has taken appropriate steps to identify this as an area of concern in the sport itself, and to have educated as to how you can mitigate your risk. And ultimately, a court or a plaintiff is going to look to see whether, as a defense attorney, whether we can identify those specific items that will create a situation where we have implemented a best practice that can then demonstrate in good faith that we are proceeding, and this is not a situation where it was a lack of care or duty that on our part by not having addressed these issues directly with the players and coaches.
Yeah, next slide, Brett. So as we move on to the second area here, I think it's a really important area to consider is protective equipment. And I think that as we think about athletics and protective equipment, oftentimes we think about the appropriate equipment to be able to participate and play in your sport. But much of the equipment that we issue is actually considered equipment that actually protects the athlete and is responsible for protecting the athlete appropriately from injury or harm. And so the National Operating Committee of Standards for Athletic Equipment, or NAIA, does provide national standards for this sort of protective equipment. And equipment needs to meet those national standards. It's really important to recognize, I think, that these national standards apply to equipment that's unaltered, or equipment that is actually being used in an appropriate fashion. So once you alter the equipment, once you do something to the equipment, you can actually invalidate the standard that's there, and athletes and coaches and others need to know that can may be better to play this sport. Some athletes like their equipment altered, but they may then actually be putting themselves at risk if they're altering that equipment. And so that's a really important piece to think about when we're thinking about a protective equipment. But this document states that every member school and any association should establish a policy to assure annual certification. And there it comes up again, annual certification, recertification, and compliance is appropriate with all protective equipment standards, i.e. if you're issuing equipment, making certain that equipment meets the standards that are there to provide the protection that it's supposed to provide. And Jason, I'm certain that you probably have a couple comments here on the importance of how this equipment needs to be able to provide that protection that it's advertised to do.
Yeah, from a risk standpoint and a mitigation of risk standpoint, I think it is imperative that there is some process in place to identify that individuals were advised that altering their equipment could result in additional injury and invalidate this particular standard. So it's almost on an individual basis where you can provide specific waivers to student athletes. The other way to do this is through an educational process where they document the fact that they've gone through education about the appropriate use of equipment in these standards. And certainly the National Operating Committee of Standards Athletic Equipment is going to be something that courts, plaintiffs, attorneys, others will look at as an accepted standard and practice in the industry, whether or not it is one that is consistently being utilized at your institution.
Next slide, please, Brett. So this third area is an area where we're going to spend a few minutes because many of these recommendations look at acclimatization and conditioning. And again, one of the reasons is that many of student athlete tragic events have happened during things that happened outside of their sport, either in a conditioning practice, conditioning event, or during the time leading up to athletic events and acclimatization. And so this document gets very specific about what's required for those activities that occur. And I know back when I was an athlete, it just seemed like we just started with athletics and you just kind of just kind of went right into it. But we can't do that in today's climate, and we need to think about acclimatization and conditioning. So just want to spend a few minutes on some of the call outs here so that you're just aware of what some of the standards are recommended by this document. At a minimum, the expectation is that all strength and conditioning sessions, regardless of when in the year they occur, so that it doesn't matter when they're happening. And this is considering that a strength and conditioning session is some sort of session that is not sport specific, where athletes are participating to train for their sport, is that they need to be evidence or consensus based. And this becomes really important in the reviews that we do, is that people can't just make things up, so to speak. They can't just decide that something seems like a good idea to train someone. They should be specific to the sport that the person's training for. They need to be intentionally administered, which means there needs to be a reason why you're doing that activity. They need to be monitored appropriately, irrespective of the phase of training, meaning that all phases, even early and late in the phase of training, need to be monitored. And this fifth part you're going to see come up over and over again, is that they cannot be punitive in nature. So one of the things that it just comes out of this document in just kind of with a red flag everywhere, is that you cannot use exercise or any sort of training as punishment for athletes. And the thing that's really interesting, and I know Jason will comment on this, is whose perception is it that the activity is used as punishment? And many of the folks we've been involved with have suggested that it's the athlete's perception. If they perceive that they're being punished with an activity, there could be an issue there. So Jason, I don't know if you have a comment on that as we talk about these types of activities.
Yeah, I think that this is an issue that comes up more and more often in my particular practice. So we're in a situation where there is a fine line between hard coaching and what is old school coaching versus what is a dangerous activity. And that's a difficult line to draw sometimes for individuals, especially of my era and older, that we're used to difficult coaching, but there is a standard there. The standard is the athlete's perception and whether the activity is based on a sport-specific need, as opposed to, as Dr. Borcher said, a result of something that has occurred and the coach using that as a training, teaching method in a punitive way. And as I think is the case in a lot of jurisdictions, they're going to look at this from an evidence-based standpoint. Was there an athletic need to do the activity? And if not, they certainly are going to look at the athlete's perception of what has occurred. And we've seen this happen over and over again, unfortunately, in the sport of football, preseason conditioning activities, because it's a sport where toughness, quote unquote, is something that old school coaches preach. And it can be difficult for administrators because you're in an area where even if you have complaints, it's not a Title IX issue. It's not an NCAA rule or NAIA rule violation issue that's out there. And so, where are you at? And really, you have to judge what activities and know what activities your coaches are putting your student athletes through. And ultimately, you're going to be held to a standard if there is an incident.
Thanks, Jason. Next slide, please, Brett. So again, just to think about how training and conditioning sessions should be used, that they need to be introduced intentionally, gradually, and that there needs to be a progressive cadence to these sorts of activities to encourage proper exercise acclimatization and minimize the risk of adverse effects on health. And again, I think we've described this as kind of a teacher having a lesson plan as they work a class through various steps to get the information that they need. We need to think about how that would apply in these sorts of training and conditioning sessions in this fashion. Next slide, please. Another area that is really emphasized here, and I just want to emphasize this because I think it's an area that we need to consider, and it's one of the things we get asked a lot about are these transition periods. And so acclimatization and conditioning, really the highest risk for these catastrophic injuries and oftentimes sudden death is during a transition period. And you can see here two types of transition periods. The transition period is defined, and this is well defined in the literature, as the first 7 days of any new conditioning period. And so you need to think about that 7-day period, and that individual transition periods occur when an individual athlete is new to a program. So it could be a transfer athlete or someone who's just being added to the team or someone who's joining the team late, an athlete who's returning after an injury or an illness, so a prolonged injury or illness, and having the appropriate amount of time to transition back to full activity. Those athletes, as I mentioned, that have delayed participation relative to the team's schedule for whatever reason. And so we see oftentimes individuals trying to catch up quickly or trying to get back to play very quickly. And oftentimes they violate this cadence of this transition period, but that we know that puts them somewhat at risk. But we also have to think about team transition periods. And we know that we see a number of issues in team transition periods when teams come back to training after an academic break. Winter, spring, summer breaks, when seasons end and they take time off at the end of those seasons. We see a number of issues that come up during this time when people are going back to activity. So we need to understand what's appropriate during these transition periods and be aware that they need to occur. And from a medical standpoint, it's very important that athletes have the appropriate ability to acclimatization during these periods, whether that has to do with the environment, could be heat or cold, whether that has to do with the type of activity, or whether it has to do with what they're getting prepared to do, which may be an off-season training program, or it may be an in-season sport training program. So Jason, I think this idea of transition periods, and I know we get asked a lot of questions about these transition periods and when these occur, and a number of catastrophic events have occurred during these transition periods. From your standpoint, the importance of, paying attention to these sorts of transition periods.
Yeah, and there are industry standards. There are standards that are out there, both at the high school and college level, that you can look to as guidance, and that's what the courts will look at. And in these transition periods, what we're really talking about, again, is what would a reasonably prudent person do? What would a reasonable coach do in the same or similar circumstances? If it's 105 degrees, should we be doing gassers, at 10 times? Is that a reasonable exercise in the conditions during a transition period? All of those factors are going to be looked at if there is a catastrophic event. But I think that the guidance here really is to understand what your coaches are doing during these transition periods, that they have a plan, and that you understand as an institution that plan is consistent with what the best practices are in the industry in that particular sport.
Thanks, Jason. Next slide. So I think here again, we get back to documentation, and I think Jason mentioned this, but all training and conditioning sessions should be documented. And again, I'll just reiterate, one of the strategies that we've recommended during this time is considering this as like a lesson plan that a strength and conditioning or head sport coach might use in order to get their athletes into an appropriate training or conditioning session. But documentation is so key here, because when we review these sorts of incidents, or when we go work with institutions to talk about how to do this, oftentimes there's this lack of documentation, and then it becomes very hard to establish a cadence or timeline to how these sessions were initiated. It's also really important to know that if you have credentialed strength and conditioning professionals, and I'll back up even for a second, if you have strength and conditioning professionals, they need to be credentialed. They need to be appropriately credentialed if they're working at your institution. Those folks really should be the folks that are documenting and approving these training and conditioning sessions. But if you don't happen to have those at your institution, it's really the responsibility of the head sport coach to make certain that those are documented and part of their plan moving forward. And Jason, again, I guess I just asked for another brief comment on the importance of documentation in these sorts of processes.
Yeah, and it's critical. It's critical in terms of a risk management and controlling your risk standpoint, but it's really critical for the health and safety of your athletes, because the more requirements that there are to document this, the less likely there is for there to be a rogue coach or a rogue event that occurs outside of what you would expect to be a normal practice activity. And so it's not only important from a legal risk standpoint, but from a real health and safety standpoint of your athletes, that this requirement, which isn't something out of the ordinary for coaches to have a documented plan, that this requirement is something that you're monitoring and that you are maintaining as an institution.
Next slide, please, Brett. Again, when we have these plans, they need to be reproducible, so they need to be available, and they really need to be available to any primary athletic healthcare providers, specifically athletic trainers or physicians, prior to the session to be able to be reviewed if there's a question about their safety. And then the document does call for a disciplinary system to be developed for those that fail to follow these recommendations. But this actual collaboration between the medical staff, the coaching staff, and strength and conditioning or sport performance providers is critical to make certain that that there's a proactive plan in place to try to make certain that these sessions don't lead to catastrophic injury or even worse, potentially sudden death in an athlete. Next slide, please. The fourth area that this document calls out are emergency action plans. And emergency action plans are critical because they really communicate to all stakeholders how an emergency should be handled and what everyone's responsibility is during the time of an emergency. So emergency action plans really need to be specific to venues. They need to be specific to the areas that they're at. They need to be transparent and readily available to everyone. They need to be rehearsed. And this is really an important point. These plans have to be rehearsed with anyone who might be asked to respond to an emergency. And so it's really important to make certain that those rehearsals occur and they occur on a regular basis. And again, here it is again, they need to be documented. The plans need to be documented, but those rehearsals and how they occurred need to be documented. And that's really, really important. Jason, your comments on the emergency action planning process?
Yeah, it's a critical component of an overall risk management strategy. And I say that because I've seen emergency action plans actually save student athletes' lives. We usually get involved after the fact in terms of evaluating or conducting an investigation as to what occurred and where a system broke down. And when there is an emergency action plan, what we have seen is it's far less likely that in the case I'm thinking of off the top of my head, the heat illness resulted in a death or a catastrophic long-term injury. And so, these should be thought of really institutionally, not just athletics department, but institutionally. What are we doing to ensure that there are plans in place for all areas of our venues that are being utilized by both our student athletes and then student athletes from other institutions.
Next slide, please, Brett. I'm not going to read all of these, but again, you should just know that this document calls out a minimum number of emergency action plans for the following non-traumatic catastrophic injuries, which includes a number of very common medical situations which can occur in athletes. It's really important, we think, to be able to collaborate with experts to be able to help put these together so you're not feeling like you need to recreate the wheel every time you're thinking about this. But one specific emergency that I want to call out that I know is really important to institutions here is the mental health emergency. It's so important that you have a mental health emergency action plan and that anyone that could be asked to respond to a mental health emergency is able to do so. And we think about this very often, as Jason just mentioned, in all these kind of medical athlete collapse situations, asthma, cardiac arrest, heat illness, muscle breakdown from workouts. But it's really important too to have a mental health emergency action plan, and that's become more and more specific as we've gotten into working with institutions on their emergency action planning. Next slide.
Just real briefly, real briefly on that, Dr. Borchers. What I have seen is at smaller institutions that we serve as general counsel for or have counseled, a real good collaboration with their student affairs department to address mental health concerns across campus. oftentimes there are strong processes that are already in place at your campus that you can build upon for athletes in this area. So I would just encourage you to partner on campus to ensure that you're using all the resources that are at your disposal.
Great. Next slide, please, Brett. The fifth area really talks about the responsibilities of athletics personnel, and I think this is really important to consider. Again, it calls out again that physical activity should not be used for punishment, but that there's a duty for athletics personnel to stop these activities and to report them appropriately. And again, it calls out again that these activities need to be administered by properly credentialed professionals, but that these professionals need to be able to respond to emergencies associated with all training activities, i.e., if your coaches or other folks that work with athletes that are not medical professionals have basic life support training and are trained to respond to emergencies, that they need to be able to do so. And that's why rehearsing emergency action plans are so important. No one gets to disown their accountability when an emergency happens. They need to be able to respond. Next slide, please. The other thing that this area calls out is that sports medicine staff, and specifically athletic trainers, should have unchallengeable authority to cancel or modify workouts for health and safety reasons. And that should be unchallengeable at that time and shouldn't be questioned, because that can put student athletes certainly at risk. And that all strength and conditioning professionals should have some sort of reporting line into sports medicine or sports performance lines of the institution. Again, looking at the structure of your institution. And Jason, you want to comment on some of that structure and how important that is?
Yeah, this goes to the very beginning of doing an audit of where your risks are. And some of that can come from reporting structures and who is involved in that process of determining what is appropriate or not appropriate at a given practice. I think that, from my perspective as in the law and risk management area, that you really want to have a really consistent monitoring system set up where an individual with authority over the coach is present at practice on a regular basis, and that individual conveys the independent nature of sports medicine, whatever that way, shape, or form that takes on your campus. It is critical in demonstrating that there is, again, these evidence-based training methods are occurring, and that there's some accountability for the actions of coaches. Again, at institutions with lower resources, or where you're spread thin from a staffing perspective, this can become challenging. But I think it's a critical component to ensure health and safety, and to document that you are doing that. As an administrator that's responsible for football, basketball, baseball, that you are regularly observing the activities that that are going on in those particular sports.
Thanks. Next slide, please, Brett. The last area that this document calls out is education and training. And it's really important, I think, to recognize that each institution should adopt requirements for the education and training of athletics personnel. And this is a minimum, but not limited to, strength and conditioning professionals, sport coaches, athletics healthcare providers, which includes athletic trainers, physicians, and others, student athletes and their parents, and athletics administrators. So there's a large group of people that at a minimum need to have some education around a significant number of areas. And so if we go to the next slide here, education needs to occur and record compliance with this education on an annual basis. And again, we have really encouraged institutions to look at programming opportunities that can accomplish this, rather than trying to look at how personnel can accomplish this, because you need this training to be pertinent to each group of required participants. And in the next slide here, just to highlight, and again, not to look and read about this, but there's just a number of issues that come through the education and training portion of this that people should be required to look at and be aware of. And all of this is to try to create that culture that we talked about at the beginning at the institution to prevent these sorts of events from occurring. And so, Jason, just comments on education and training from your standpoint as we get towards the end here.
Yeah, it's often, as I mentioned, it's the first area of risk management and preventative law that you look to implement, in part because you're able to document it. It's relatively straightforward to do. and you can do it on a consistent basis. And it forms the basis of what you're trying to accomplish from a cultural standpoint in all other areas. We have figured out a way in a highly regulated area, whether it's the rules of the NAIA or the requirements of Title IX, or other federal requirements that when it comes to financial aid, we figured out a way to educate students, to provide applicable policies and procedures. One area where I think institutions in higher education has fallen short is on the area of health and safety. And I think that based on the trajectory of legislation, student athlete rights movements, that this is an area everyone is going to have to catch up on quickly. And there's going to be some specific requirements. And if you can get out ahead of that by having some implementation of these education and training modules early on, I think that you're going to be not only managing risk and controlling and reducing what types of risk you're facing on your institution's campus, but also setting yourself up for future success in dealing with a changing landscape that I think we're all going to experience in college athletics.
Next slide, please, Brett. So the real key to this is preparation and action. And as Jason mentioned earlier, the ultimate goal should be developing an institutional culture committed to optimal athletic healthcare and safety. And that's really at the U.S. Council for Athletes Health, what we help folks do. So we want to make certain we review policies and procedures, discuss them with key personnel, develop those that are important. We want to develop an annual plan for implementation and compliance, use programming that's available. There are ways to do this that are not heavily resource dependent and expensive. And those can be accomplished by many institutions and organizations. And then the other key is to go beyond the minimum standards. Think about being proactive. Think about the steps you can take, as Jason just mentioned, to get ahead of this. And certainly that's the goal of this collaboration today, is to let you know that there are ways that we can help do that. If we go to the next slide, that's really the end of our formal presentation. Certainly any questions here, and I think there was one question here in the chat, Dan, that went back to punishment, and I think we have just a minute. We can probably address this. Is would a 2-mile timed run as a preseason fitness test be considered punitive for a sport like baseball? And from a medical standpoint, it all comes down to the way it's communicated, just like we talk about treatments, just like we talk about interventions. Why are we doing the 2-mile timed run test? Is it to provide a baseline fitness level? Is it to measure what sort of fitness there is when someone comes in? How do we know if athletes are ready for a 2-mile timed run? And is there punishment if they don't make that time, if there's something that happens with that 2-mile timed run? And so I think it comes down to a communication issue. And then obviously that communication leads to the perception of the athlete of why we're actually doing this activity. I've used the example in the past of, running, for example, if we miss free throws. And when I've seen coaches use the explanation of we need to create an environment where there's pressure around this. And so as part of our overall practice plan, part of our conditioning will be if we miss free throws at the end of practice, we're going to be running to create the pressure around those free throws as we might have at the end of the game. That's much different than singling someone out and having them run what seems to be unnecessarily for something that's going on. So, Jason, other comments on this 2-mile run from your standpoint?
Yeah, I think from what you're addressing here is accurate. That all of those factors will be taken into account. I guess I would just say, what is the standard again in the industry? Is there a documented standard for conditioning activities for baseball athletes that is accepted by the strength and conditioning community? And how is that typically applied in the sport of baseball? And I think, you really, if you get that question, you have to really ask yourself, is there value in this activity, or is it an activity that is something that is being done for some other purpose? And if that is that other purpose, one that should be a part of the sport, and so it becomes judgment calls, certainly, but you can do that based upon evidence of what is a typical activity in the particular sport.
Yeah, I think that goes back to making certain these activities are intentional, and that they're sport specific, and these recommendations call that out. Thanks for that question. It's a great question.
And we had a couple more just direct messages. I'll try the first one and see how much time we have. Had a couple people kind of reach out and ask if there's templates for emergency action plans that you guys would suggest just as a starting point.
Yeah, I think we do, at USCA, we work with institutions to provide those sorts of templates and to work with them to, meet the standard. I think what's really important here is to understand, and Jason can comment on this, there is no cookie cutter approach to this. And by that, I mean, it's not one emergency action plan applies to any situation, but there are ways to take some templated material and very quickly transform it into something that meets the institution's needs. And you shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to do, for example, be figuring out how to write these things. So if you work with groups of experts, these things can be accomplished fairly quickly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're not going to have to recreate the wheel in this. And that's, certainly what USCA has done. And they've created some policies and procedure templates out there. What we have done is assist institutions in customizing those and addressing any legal concerns that come as a result of those, and how those might be viewed if there are concerns that are raised in a particular area because of an incident, or in particular whether this would assist in mitigating the institution's overall risk, and how that will factor in of decisions that you're making in terms of financial decisions for insurance and other areas. So, but to Dr. Borcher's point, I think USCA is a tremendous resource. This is why we at Husch Blackwell partner with them. But certainly, if you got online, you can find generals, what these generally look like. But what we would recommend is that you talk with the medical experts and also the legal experts.
Dan, any other questions?
Yeah, we'll do last one. This was a sports specific one. Somebody wanted to know, is the helmet as a weapon for football treated the same as talking to soccer student athletes about using their cleats as a weapon?
Yes, the sportsmanship standard in these recommendations calls out specifically the use of the head or the helmet. So for a soccer player, it's actually the head as a weapon. Built into that standard is the overall ethical concerns of sportsmanship, which means you should never be using any sort of piece of equipment to harm another athlete that you're with. So from that standpoint, it would make sense that, obviously you wouldn't be using the cleat, in a way outside the normal course of play in that sport to harm an athlete. So I think it's just important. Those basic tenets of sportsmanship just need to be reviewed, obviously, from that recommendation annually. And although it specifically calls out the use of a helmet or the head as a weapon, certainly that would translate to any other piece of equipment or anything else in a sport that would be outside the normal course of participation in that sport.
Yeah. And from a legal risk standpoint, you're really talking about what kind of instruction is being provided to the athletes in these particular areas. And, there is an interesting series of cases out there about, athletes who were instructed to use their equipment in a way that was not consistent with the rules. And that obviously creates liability, not only for the institution, but for the coaches and even potentially for the participants. So it does come down to understanding how your coaches are instructing. And then, we could come full circle and say, education. If you're checking that box, oftentimes you're able to demonstrate that you've at least provided some level of specific guidance that is documented for your teams and athletes.
Thanks so much, Brett. I think maybe one more slide. I think this information will be available to the folks here. And again, just want to say thank you. I know we're just a few minutes over, but thank you to the NAIA for allowing us to present this information today. And know that if you're looking for solutions to this and other of your athletic healthcare needs, certainly USCA and Husch Blackwell are eager to discuss that with you and work with your institution to provide solutions that make this part of your overall culture and a pillar of your athletics program. So thank you so much for all of you joining us today, and please don't hesitate to reach out. Jason, final comments?
I'll echo those comments. I really have been impressed with what USCA has done. We've been a partner with them at Hush Blackwell. I'm excited that they're involved with the NAIA. I think they have great tools for institutions, and as Dr. Borchers said, anything that we can do to assist you all, create a safe environment for your athletes, we're happy to discuss that.
That's well said. Thank you both very much for your time and your expertise today. We appreciate you joining us all, and thank you all very much. Have a good day.